Tens of thousands of people in Myanmar took to the streets over the weekend, crying foul after a military coup that overthrew democratically elected leaders of the ruling party, including de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Last Monday, a new parliament was set to hold its opening session after the country's second free election in 2020 saw another landslide victory for Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy. This was a result that former military rulers could not accept after losing the 2015 elections. Reiterating their ungrounded claim that the November election had been fraudulent, the military seized back control of the country, declaring a year-long state of emergency, and arrested Suu Kyi and President Win Myint, hitting them with criminal charges. This has sent shockwaves around the world and a sense of déjà vu as the country fell back into a state of repressive military rule that had gripped the nation for almost half a century. Will this permanently reverse progress towards democracy in Myanmar, which began only a decade ago? And can the will of the people win back their government under their beloved leader? For this, we connect with Christopher Ankerson, Clinical Associate Professor at New York University Center for Global Affairs. We were supposed to be joined by a journalist based in Myanmar, but due to the instability of mobile services there, we have not been able to reach him. So we will welcome Christopher Ankerson today. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Dr. Ankerson, now there seemed to be relative quiet in the first few days following the coup last week and the military's shutdown of various telecommunication services, of course. But over the weekend, we saw tens of thousands of people in Myanmar taking to the streets. No reports of violence yet, but do you think there might be a danger that the situation could spiral into violence?
I think both sides right now have a good incentive to keep things as they were on the weekend. Active, there was respect on both sides, and an attempt to limit the amount of confrontation and violence. The military junta realizes that international pressure would be ramped up if this were to turn bloody. Likewise, the individuals, as you can see on the screen now, are, their cause gets more legitimacy to when it focuses on democracy and a peaceful protest. So I think for now, we can see that this is likely to be the pattern. The intermittent internet and crackdown on social media use makes organizing difficult for the activists on the street, and that's why I think we saw a little bit of a delay immediately after the coup. However, violence can't be ruled out. Accidents happen. Tensions, of course, when people are in close proximity like that, do tend to rise. So I don't think anybody should be, lulled into a sense of security that there isn't going to be any violence at all.
And well, the question is why the military decided to stage the coup at this point. And there were reports that there were key differences between ruling party leader Aung San Suu Kyi and the army commander-in-chief. But what were these differences that led to the breakdown of their communications? And, well, again, why do you think the military chose this point in time to stage this coup?
I think what we have to bear in mind is that while on the surface it may have looked like Myanmar had made a significant advancement towards democratic and civilian rule, that was really a very thin veneer over top of a reality where the military still held significant amounts of involvement in politics, in economics, and in the kind of constitutional framework for the country. They had seen an advantage to opening up the country and being taken more seriously with a figurehead like Aung San Suu Kyi in the driver's seat, as it were, at least for the visibility purposes. After the November election, it became evident that Aung San Suu Kyi and her party were going to be gaining even more popularity than perhaps the army was comfortable with. The individual causes, with Min Aung Hlaing's upcoming retirement, there are reports that he was hoping for some kind of an outcome that would allow him perhaps to be put into the position of president. But after the landslide victory, over 80% of the popular vote that was achieved by the NLD, that looked very unlikely. And there were ideas floated perhaps that he might be offered a vice presidential position, which would be a very big kind of a demotion or come down for him. He did not see that as being workable. So you've got kind of a structural piece where the military no longer saw the advantage of having a civilian veneer, but also a personal or actor-led one where Senior General Min Aung Hlaing no longer could see an advantage to working with Aung San Suu Kyi either.
And the army declared a year-long state of emergency. What do you think they're trying to achieve within that time?
Well, I would say that I would be careful about, seeing this as a year-long. Certainly, if we look at the way things have worked out in the past in Myanmar, but also in the region, in Thailand, for example, the coup that happened in 2014 had a slipping timeline, very often kind of put forward, and eventually, as we know, the civilian elections didn't happen for another 5 years. I think we will probably see the same thing in Myanmar. The year starts off, it sounds very reasonable. It sounds like there's some, rearrangements to be made. There's this idea that perhaps, as you guys already said, very, very much so, falsely ungrounded claims that there were irregularities with the election. A 1 year kind of state of emergency makes it sound like there's an end in sight, but I would be very, very surprised if we actually saw the military relinquishing power within that year.
And now, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi is back under house arrest at the age of 75. Do you think this really marks the end of her political career? The army has made some very interesting claims against her and the president of the party, saying that they'd acquired walkie-talkies out of all the excuses they could have given. Do you think this really means the end for Aung San Suu Kyi's political career at this point?
Well, I think, the military is going to rule by law rather than uphold the rule of law. So finding charges about walkie-talkie possession or import-export problems, or as they have in the past, saying, well, Aung San Suu Kyi is married to a Myanmar citizen and therefore cannot hold office. There will be any number of excuses that they can use to kind of achieve their ultimate result. Aung San Suu Kyi's role as an active participant, as a formal participant in politics, may well be over. Her health, her age certainly make us wonder if this goes on for too long, whether she'd be able to take up or retake up the civilian control. However, I think her symbolic role is far from over. Even if you listen to people from Myanmar, they will say, well, Aung San Suu Kyi is a leader with problems, with faults. There are many people who are not happy with the way that she didn't necessarily stand up to the military in the way that they would have liked, and yet she does represent the other pole. She represents a civilian and more democratic future for Myanmar than the military does. So even under house arrest, as she did previously, she plays a very large symbolic role. So I think we'll have to wait and see if she ever regains a formal role back in civilian rule. But even while under house arrest, she will be seen, and you'll see on the streets, her picture is represented as this very clear symbolic hope for the country.
And what do you think this means for her party? The average age of the politicians there are around 70. And do you think there's a chance that the younger generation will really stand up for their human rights and for democracy?
That's an interesting question. And again, I think sometimes from the outside, we're focused on Aung San Suu Kyi and even on the NLD at the national level. But at lower levels, at the district level, the NLD was by far the biggest winner of even low-level political posts. So even those have been annulled or canceled because of the election in November. So there's much more disenfranchisement going on under the surface than we would necessarily see if we only focus on what's happening in Naypyidaw. So I think the NLD has had its legs kind of taken out from underneath it. But and while there are other parties, they are certainly the lightning rod and the symbolic representation of civilian rule. I think the youth of Myanmar, and this is again, not specific to Myanmar. We see it in Hong Kong. We see it in Thailand. They are the ones that perhaps are the least likely to put up with this kind of military takeover. Whether that means they form their own party, whether they try to in some senses be nonpartisan and push towards even more democratic rule, because again, I think many people in Myanmar see the limitations of the compromise situation that we had seen previously. As I mentioned earlier, not everybody was ecstatic or overly happy with the way the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi were cooperating with the military. Defenders would say they had no choice. It was a kind of a that or nothing. They had to make overtures and play nice with the military, lest they be taken out of power even earlier. But I think there's much that's going on now in Myanmar that looks to a post-NLD future that could easily see other parties, other movements growing out of what we're going to see on the streets now and for the foreseeable future in Myanmar.
Ms. Suu Kyi's defense of the army's alleged genocide against the Rohingya group. Now, that raised a lot of controversy, and it was a real letdown for the international community. And while the general since then, the key members of the army have been sanctioned by countries around the world. And of course, with this coup, more sanctions there has been talk of placing more sanctions on the military regime. But do you think international sanctions are going to have any effect at this point?
As you mentioned, there's already a fairly robust sanctions regime, personal sanctions against members of the military for their involvement in the genocidal mass violence against the Rohingya, which means in some senses it's difficult for the United States, for example, to ramp up more sanctions. There are a number of countries, however, that are involved in other economic aspects of Myanmar. For example, it's been well documented how much the Chinese have a trade as well as a geo-economic relationship with Myanmar. There could theoretically be some leverage there, although I think that's very, very unlikely. The stability of the country is much more important to Chinese investors and government than would necessarily anything else. There are other countries like Japan that has a sizable amount of investment, if not trade relations. They have a fairly large investment relationship. They have taken some steps, for example, cutting off some of their relationships with the military-owned companies like breweries, etc. But it's unlikely that they are going to make a sanctions effort. It's pretty clear from what Japan has said so far that that's not likely. Other countries that have large investments in Myanmar, such as Singapore and Thailand, work within the ASEAN framework, where mutual non-interference tends to rule the day, tends to be the overarching principle. So I think it's unlikely. It's not impossible that under a Biden administration, this is an opportunity perhaps to work some coalition building where allies and other nations in and around Asia, for example, India, might be persuaded as a way perhaps of putting pressure on China to band together and up their pressure on Myanmar as a way of essentially putting pressure on China indirectly. But I think for right now, sanctions in and of themselves are unlikely to happen and are unlikely to work. The real balancing act, there's I think a three-way balancing act. One is to use sanctions as a way of convincing the military to reinstall democratic rule. That's a delicate balancing act. The next one is as a way of getting sanctions to not hurt regular, everyday, rank and file Myanmarese and only have them targeted to the military, which again, it can be difficult to do, very difficult to be that surgical or that laser-like. And then lastly, and we've heard Japan say this already, as well as some concerns that coming out of the Biden administration, is a fear of, quote unquote, pushing Myanmar even further into the Chinese orbit, as it were, as a way of not wanting to perhaps go to very, very biting sanctions, giving Myanmar no choice but to run to Beijing for relief.
Well, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said Friday that he will push for international coordination on this and efforts to try and reverse this military coup that happened last week. And as you said, it looks like it's going to need a lot of targeted sanctions and a lot of global cooperation to make this happen. But this is where we'll have to leave the interview today. That was Christopher Ankerson, Clinical Associate Professor at New York University Center for Global Affairs. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching.